Hello, welcome to our talk. How will ISO 22955 affect designs for open plan offices? My name is Jack Harvie-Clark and this paper is a collaboration with Ethan Bordeaux from the International World Building Institute in New York and Patrick Chevret and Laurent Boccolini of INRS in France. The role for offices is being completely re-evaluated by some companies, while other companies are going back to do what they've always done in offices. So it's a changing time for office design. This standard, the acoustic quality of open office spaces, was published in May 2021, but obviously it was written before the pandemic started. What we've done here is a pilot study using qualitative research methods. This means that we selected a sample of experts from the European region and we talked to them. We used interviews, had written submissions, and then we used thematic analysis to investigate the themes using grounded theory. This follows 6 steps: familiarisation with the data, generation of initial codes, the search for themes, review of potential themes, defining and naming the themes, and then production of this paper. We had 6 participants, so it was a relatively small study. One of them comes from workplace design, so his principal role is in designing workplaces. He's not an acoustics expert, but takes acoustics into account in their job. One person works for an acoustics products manufacturer. Their role is not sales, but it's to do with finding out what people might need in offices for acoustic solutions. 3 participants work in occupational health and safety. 2 of them in national research institutes, and one's a corporate health and safety manager in a company. One of them was an acoustic consultant. So the questions aren't the most important thing. They're, if you like, to start the conversation around acoustics, but I thought you might be interested in the questions that we asked, so I've put them in here. So what do you see as the obstacles to good acoustics and main drivers of poor acoustic conditions for occupants? How has the pandemic changed the way that people want to design their offices? How will the new standard assist all stakeholders to improve acoustic conditions for occupants? And can acousticians use the tools in this new standard to help educate facilities managers on opportunities to improve acoustic conditions in open plan offices? The key themes that I want to talk about today are first of all around density of occupation and the lack of a common narrative and knowledge around acoustics and acoustic conditions in open plan offices. So they weren't the questions at all, but that's what we've picked out from them. There's another one around increased acoustic risks from teleconference calls, and this is in the way that the use of offices will change because office work has essentially changed. But I'm going to concentrate on those first 2 bullets for the rest of this presentation. So when we look at answers to this first question, and this is some of the data that people gave us. They suggested that desk sizes are getting smaller, it's increasing density, and that's increasing the acoustic risks. And someone else saying similar things. Density has always been problematic from an acoustic perspective. So how can we dive into this question of density in the literature and in guidance? If we look in the literature, first of all, going back to a 2002 report, so this was a literature review of 19 previous studies. So since the 1980s, people have been linking higher density of occupation in offices with occupants' environmental satisfaction, of which acoustics is a part. So people have been writing about associations between density and poor acoustic conditions for a long time. A more recent report put it more bluntly. Density of occupation strongly impacted on users' satisfaction with acoustics and privacy, but they still didn't feel like they had enough data points to identify different types of outcomes at different densities. If we look at the British Council for Offices guide to British Council for Offices guide to office occupancy, density and utilisation from 2018. This follows on from previous reviews in 2009 and 2013. And what they concluded in 2018 was actually that in the last preceding decade, offices had got a little bit denser. So there'd been a slight increase in offices where people had between 8 and 10 square metres per person. But really it was the decade before that where there had been a significant densification of offices. And they also highlight how occupation or occupancy, if you like, can vary significantly between offices. So this is also going to affect the acoustic conditions, how many people are actually there at any one time. And typically you can see from this somewhere between 40 and 50% is normal for occupation in open plan offices. If we look at the acoustic standards and guidance, however, we know, obviously you're all familiar with the indicators in ISO 3382 Part 3, and I'm sure as well with the review of those and how effective they are at predicting acoustic satisfaction or people who are highly annoyed. So some highlights from that paper. Relatively poor levels, I would say, of correlation between radius of distraction, even less so with speech level at 4 metres, although I am aware that there's other research teams have added their data into this and find a better correlation with speech level at 4 metres and people who are highly disturbed by noise. Distraction distance showing no correlation at all, and some correlation from the background sound level. But these don't tell us anything about the density of the office, how many people are affected by unwanted speech. And there's been a renewed interest in the comfort distance, which is the distance at which speech falls to 45 dB. So this is described in terms of meters, has dimensions of meters, but it doesn't describe how many people are affected by sound at that level. Desk densities are usually described in meters squared per person, which has dimensions of meters squared. So if density is important, our hypothesis is, can we put those two things together and think about maybe the number of people conceptually who are within the comfort distance? So is acoustic satisfaction some function of comfort distance and desk density? Now, unfortunately, we don't have the data to investigate that, but I think it would be very useful, important even. And this is why. When a company starts looking for a new office, the first thing it thinks is how many people need to occupy it. And they work off standard guidance for office densities and look for an office of that size. The acoustic design typically doesn't get involved until later on. So that first decision of how big the office was made, if density is important, might have very important implications for acoustic outcomes. So the acoustic design might have actually started there, but that person didn't know. Now, at the minute, there's no information. As acoustic consultants, designers, we can't say that if you design to an office with a high density, don't expect good acoustic outcomes, because that information doesn't quite exist. So moving on to the second main theme that we picked out, causes of poor acoustic conditions, and around the lack of a common narrative. So this is what people told us. Late consideration of acoustics in projects, lack of a multidisciplinary approach, lack of activity analysis, space planning, level of awareness. Nobody knows what to do, especially decision makers aren't aware of how important it is. So one participant saying it's a lack of understanding of the activity. Someone else was expecting activity to be a strong predictor of acoustic dissatisfaction, but actually found that personality was a much stronger variable. So I don't think that's actually necessarily contradictory. People not knowing how to behave in spaces. And this, to me, is getting to the key point, is that where do you go to get cohesive information about what the issues are and what you can do about them? So we know that unwanted speech is the main problem, but how can we design offices better? In the slides that I showed you before, we can see that room acoustic response, or the indicators from 3382 part 3, are not the whole story. They don't predict good acoustic outcomes alone. So ISO 22955 does start to talk about how we can improve conditions in use and other aspects of acoustic satisfaction, but I think we probably need to go much further than that. So there are very different approaches that have been proposed, taking a psychoacoustic approach, so starting with personality to address noise problems in offices. This study looked at used a soundscape approach, and they actually concluded that the most important things for acoustic satisfaction were the level of control that people had over their working environment and the acoustic space planning. Now, acoustic space planning is mentioned and addressed to some degree in ISO 22955, but the level of control is not really addressed. So we had a very nice case study on the importance of control to demonstrate just how important control is for acoustic outcomes. So I think we need a much more holistic approach to designing for acoustic satisfaction based on what I call 3 pillars. Thinking first of all about people, their level of control and the culture in the company. Some companies want a noisy, vibrant office, for example. Then there's the activities, the acoustic space planning and the in situ environment, to consider those things. And also the room acoustic response, going back to the indicators in 3382 part 3. We can't do any one of these things alone, really they're all done together, but I think we need to think much more holistically if we want to have good acoustic outcomes. So I say the most important thing is the questions that you ask of your acoustic designer to get good acoustic outcomes. Looking forward to some questions. Thank you. And thank you very much to my collaborators on this who are listed there.